The year is 2035. You are an American tourist wandering across a continent that once defined power, philosophy, and human ambition. Your morning begins in Paris, under a sky still stained with the romance of old Europe. By noon, you are in Rome, thanks to a hyperloop that feels more futuristic than the cities it connects. When evening comes, you are drinking a beer in Berlin, surrounded by the quiet hum of a place that should feel alive but does not. Europe is still beautiful. Its cathedrals still rise above narrow streets. Its art still glows with centuries of genius. Its food still tastes like history itself. From the outside, nothing looks broken. Yet something in the air feels hollow, like a grand palace whose foundation is quietly crumbling. The streets are spotless, but strangely silent. The cafés are full, but the laughter is thin, dominated by gray hair and slow movements. And when you try to buy a souvenir, you discover that the shopkeeper does not speak French, Italian, or German. That is because the store is no longer owned by anyone local. Then you begin to notice the pattern. The port is owned by a Chinese conglomerate. The energy grid is controlled by investors from the Gulf. Entire city blocks belong to an American private equity fund. You are not walking through a superpower. You are walking through the most expensive open-air museum in the world, a continent that won the last millennium, now struggling to stay relevant in this one. Back in the year 2008, none of this seemed possible. Europe and the United States were economic twins. They had economies of similar size, similar standards of living, and similar ambitions. On paper, Europe was the older and wiser sibling. It was slightly richer, with stronger social protections and one of the highest qualities of life on Earth. But if you fast forward to today, the twins have grown apart. The American economy surged past $27 trillion. Europe barely crawled beyond $17 trillion. The gap between them is now so large that it equals the entire economy of Japan. That gap has simply evaporated from Europe's side of the scale. How does a continent with the world's finest healthcare, deepest history, and most educated population fall so far and so fast? The uncomfortable answer is that it did not fall. It jumped. This was not a random accident. It was not an unavoidable tragedy. It was slow and deliberate, a form of bureaucratic suicide. And in the next 30 minutes, we are going to examine the 6 fatal wounds that have drained Europe of its power, its confidence, and most dangerously, its future. If any of this sounds exaggerated, look at the numbers. Since the financial crisis of the year 2008, the United States grew by nearly 87%. Europe grew by only 13%. If nothing changes, the average European in the year 2050 will be poorer than the average resident of Mississippi, which is one of the poorest states in America. Let that settle in your mind. A continent that once ruled 2/3 of the world might soon struggle to match the living standards of a region Americans rarely brag about. So enjoy that espresso while you can still afford it, because the first wound strikes directly at the heart of Europe's wealth. It is the death of industry. For decades, Germany was the engine of Europe. Heavy industry was the engine of Germany. Cars, chemicals, and precision machines. These are the things that make the modern world possible. Germany built a system that seemed brilliant on paper. It relied on military protection from the United States. It fueled its factories with cheap natural gas from Russia, and it sold its finished products to China, whose growing middle class admired German engineering. It was clever, it was efficient, it was also deeply fragile. When the Nord Stream pipelines exploded, both on the seabed of the Baltic Sea and at the political level, the German model did not merely weaken, it collapsed almost overnight. Consider BASF, the largest chemical producer on Earth. Their headquarters in Ludwigshafen is so massive that it feels like a small country. They produce ingredients for toothpaste, sneakers, automobiles, and medicine. For decades, BASF was Germany's quiet economic titan. It lowered costs, supported thousands of small businesses, and anchored an entire ecosystem of European manufacturing. Then came the year 2024. BASF made a decision that should have alarmed every politician in Berlin. They shut down major production lines inside Germany. The reason was simple. Chemistry needs energy, and enormous amounts of it. After losing Russian gas and mishandling a rushed transition toward renewable power, Germany's electricity prices rose to levels where producing chemicals was not merely unprofitable, it was mathematically impossible. So BASF moved its future to China. They invested $10 billion in a new mega facility in Guangdong. The symbolism is painful. Germany, a country that prides itself on human rights and environmental purity, is now pushing its own industrial giants into the arms of a nation that burns coal as if it were limitless. A country Germany often lectured about climate policy has now become Germany's industrial refuge, and BASF is not alone. By late year 2024, German industrial output had fallen to its lowest level since the lockdowns of the COVID pandemic. Factories closed, orders disappeared, workers left. This was the quiet hollowing out of Europe's core. It was the sound of workshops flipping their signs from willkommen to closed. The situation grew even more ironic. Germany completed its nuclear phase-out in April of the year 2023, right in the middle of an energy crisis. They shut down clean and reliable nuclear power only to reopen coal mines. Entire villages were demolished to extract brown coal, which is one of the dirtiest fossil fuels on the planet. In an attempt to protect the environment, they ended up burning more carbon than before. That irony is hard to match. Maybe Europe could pivot to high technology, just like the United States did. But that path too has been blocked, and blocked by Europe itself. We will return to that later. For now, remember this detail. Europe built its wealth by making things. And today, the workshops of the continent are growing cold. If Germany's situation resembles a sudden heart attack, the next wound is more like a slow and irreversible cancer. It is the demographic collapse. Italy is a land of sunshine, beauty, and food that warms the soul. But its birth rate is now so low that it has become a warning sign. In the year 2024, Italy reached 1.18 children per woman. A stable population requires 2.1. Anything below 1.5 is considered a demographic emergency. At 1.18, the future is not shrinking. It is disappearing. Imagine a young Italian named Matteo. He is smart and hopeful. He has earned his degree, but he cannot find a job because the economy is stagnant. Rent is so high that he cannot move out of his parents' house. And yet the state expects him to pay for future children and for an entire generation of retirees above him. Europe's pension systems are not savings accounts. They are conveyor belts. Today's workers pay for today's retirees. In the 1960s, there were 4 workers supporting each retiree. By the year 2050, Italy and Spain will have fewer than 2. Consider that burden. 2 young people supporting 1 elderly person, along with their own expenses, healthcare, taxes, and government obligations. The math simply does not work. Taxes will rise, and when taxes rise, young people leave. The cycle accelerates downward. In the year 2024, Italy recorded fewer than 370,000 births. That is the lowest count since Italy became a unified nation in the year 1861. A civilization that once shaped the world is quietly approaching demographic extinction. And the worst part is this: no one can solve it politically. If a politician cuts pensions, the elderly revolt. If a politician proposes large-scale immigration, the cultural backlash is immediate. So leaders do nothing. They borrow money, they delay the crisis. But the road ahead is almost gone. And this is only the second wound. Europe's population is shrinking, its workforce is thinning, its factories are dimming. But surely, you might think, there must be a lifeline, a comeback plan, a spark of innovation that can lift the continent into the future. After all, this is the land that created the steam engine, the automobile, the jet turbine, quantum mechanics, and half of the modern sciences. It is natural to assume that Europe is not done creating. But the truth goes deeper. Europe did not simply fall behind in innovation. It abandoned innovation, quietly and gradually. The vacuum that followed became the third fatal wound. Try a simple exercise. Name a European smartphone. You might think of Nokia, which was once a titan and is now a nostalgic memory. Ericsson is gone. BlackBerry was Canadian, but the story is the same. Now try naming a European search engine. It is difficult. Try naming a European social network. If you whispered Mastodon, it likely means you enjoy configuring Linux systems for fun. The harsh reality is that in the 21st century, the world runs on digital empires. Europe is not one of those empires. Today, Europe is a digital colony. It looks polished and civilized, but it depends on Silicon Valley for nearly every major technological foundation of daily life. The group known as the Magnificent Seven, which includes Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Nvidia, Meta, and Tesla, has a combined value larger than the entire stock markets of Britain, France, Germany, and Italy combined. 7 companies outweigh centuries of European industrial development. This is not because Europeans lack talent. The web was invented at CERN. DeepMind, one of the most influential artificial intelligence labs in history, was founded in London. European universities remain among the best in the world. The problem is structural and, in some ways, psychological. Europe became a regulatory superpower, an empire built on paperwork. There's an old joke in global business. America innovates, China copies, Europe regulates. While Silicon Valley invested billions of dollars into artificial intelligence, the European Union spent those years creating the AI Act, a wide and complex set of laws designed to govern technologies that did not yet exist. It is like writing maritime law before the invention of the ship. or writing traffic laws before anyone has built a car. This is Europe's approach to innovation. It writes the safety manual before the machine is ever constructed. Consider Mistral AI, the brightest hope for European artificial intelligence. It has brilliant engineers and visionary founders. But instead of focusing all of their time on training models and scaling breakthroughs, they must navigate a maze of regulatory rules. These include the General Data Protection Regulation, the Digital Markets Act, and the Digital Services Act. Each one is a labyrinth of compliance checks and legal reporting requirements. Now, compare this to a startup in the United States. In the United States, a founder has immediate access to a single language, a unified market, consistent labor laws, and a large pool of investors. A startup can grow from a garage to a global company within months. In Europe, a French startup expanding into Germany needs new contracts, new legal teams, new tax filings, new data rules, new hiring rules, and even new product translations. Multiply that process by 27 countries and you do not get growth. You get slow and painful collapse through administrative overload. Even when Europeans succeed, the rewards often flow to America. DeepMind was purchased by Google. Skype was purchased by Microsoft. ARM, a British icon, was sold to SoftBank and later listed on the Nasdaq exchange in New York. Booking.com is controlled by an American holding company. The pattern is consistent. Europe trains the talent, America captures the capital. And that capital flight is the fourth fatal wound. Money does not lie. It simply goes where it sees opportunity and growth. It flows to the places where the future feels larger than the past. And right now, money is leaving Europe faster than at any point in modern history. Only 18% of German households invest in stocks. In the United States, that number is 58%. Europeans prefer savings accounts, which are safe but stagnant. Americans build wealth through capital markets. Because Europeans do not invest in their own companies, those companies cannot scale, so they raise money elsewhere, usually in New York. ARM Holdings, the invisible giant behind almost every smartphone chip on the planet, could have listed in London. Instead, it listed on Nasdaq. Spotify was created in Sweden but chose to list in the United States. BioNTech is a German scientific company, but its capital comes from America. Even Birkenstock, the sandal company associated with European culture, now trades on the New York Stock Exchange. This is not random. It is a cycle. European investors see low returns at home, so they invest in the S&P 500. European companies see no deep pools of capital at home, so they move to America. America grows faster, which attracts even more European investment. The loop becomes tighter over time. Europe becomes the financial version of a leaking bucket. The irony is striking. Even Norway, which is one of the richest and most disciplined nations in Europe, invests most of its sovereign wealth fund in American stocks. Europe is funding America's economic boom, while unintentionally financing its own decline. If the loss of capital is painful, the next wound is devastating. It is the energy crisis, the energy suicide. Energy is the lifeblood of every civilization. When energy is cheap, nations grow wealthier, more innovative, and more comfortable. When energy is expensive, decline begins. Europe, in its pursuit of environmental purity, chose a path that was morally admirable but strategically disastrous. For 20 years, Europe led the world in the adoption of green energy. Wind turbines rose along the coastlines. Solar farms spread across open fields. Emissions dropped. On paper, it looked like a triumph. But the hidden flaw was simple. The green transition was not paired with energy security. Europe shut down nuclear plants, which are clean, powerful, and stable. Germany closed its last 3 reactors in the year 2023, right as Russian gas supplies collapsed. Belgium took a similar path. Nuclear energy became politically inconvenient, so Europe abandoned it. At the same time, Europe banned fracking, the technology that allowed the United States to unlock cheap natural gas and fuel its manufacturing boom. Instead, Europe relied on intermittent sources like wind and solar. These sources are valuable, but they require backup power. Europe chose Russia for that backup. It built an entire energy system on the assumption that Vladimir Putin would be a reliable long-term partner, even though his foreign policy often resembles a dangerous chess match played with gasoline and flames. Then, the war in Ukraine began. The illusion collapsed. Energy prices in Europe rose to 10 times the average price in the United States. Factories that once operated with precision went dark. Households paid more for heating than for rent. The continent that invented industrial civilization suddenly could not afford the electricity to maintain it. Meanwhile, the United States enjoyed some of the cheapest energy on Earth thanks to shale gas. China continued building coal plants at a rate Europe could hardly imagine, often 2 per week. Europe sacrificed its competitiveness to reduce global emissions by a small fraction, while the rest of the world continued burning fossil fuels at full speed. And all of this happened before the final wound, the wound Europe never saw coming. The final wound cuts deeper than all the others because it reaches into the core of power, which is security. For 75 years, Europe lived inside a garden that was walled and guarded by someone else. It became prosperous, generous, and peaceful because it did not have to carry the burden of defending itself. The United States carried that burden for Europe. After the Second World War, the arrangement was simple. America built the tanks, the missiles, and the aircraft carriers. Europe built the hospitals, the pension systems, and the holidays. Americans spent trillions of dollars on global security. Europeans used that money on welfare, infrastructure, and a lifestyle admired by much of the world. It was one of the greatest bargains in modern history, but no bargain lasts forever. For decades, members of NATO promised to spend 2% of their national income on defense. Most barely reached 1%. Germany, which is Europe's economic giant, allowed much of its military equipment to rust in storage. At one point, reports stated that German soldiers had to train with broomsticks because there were not enough rifles. It sounded humorous, until the consequences became real. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the illusion of everlasting peace disappeared. Europe woke up from a 70-year dream and realized that the real world had returned. And the real world is difficult, unpredictable, and expensive. Suddenly, Europe needed ammunition, tanks, drones, and missile systems. It needed everything it had outsourced to American protection. That is when the frightening truth revealed itself. Europe no longer had the industrial capacity to defend itself in a real war. The British military would run out of ammunition in 48 hours of high-intensity combat. Germany would not last much longer. France, which is the only nuclear power on the continent besides the United Kingdom, had only a fraction of the industrial strength required for a long conflict. Even Poland, which is one of the most strategically alert countries in Europe, had to purchase tanks from South Korea because Europe could not produce enough of them. Rearming requires money. But money spent on missiles is money not spent on healthcare. Money used for air defense systems is money not used for pensions. For a continent that already struggles with slow economic growth, shrinking populations, and declining industries, this new financial burden is more than a challenge. It is a crisis without an easy solution. This crisis pushed the European Union into something close to panic. In late year 2024, European leaders asked Mario Draghi, the man who once saved the euro, to evaluate Europe's future. Draghi delivered a verdict that was simple and alarming. Europe, he warned, was dying from within. Its competitiveness had fallen so far behind the United States and China that catching up would require something similar to a new Marshall Plan every single year. He proposed annual investments of $800 billion in energy, technology, defense, infrastructure, and innovation. Not once, not for 5 years, but every year. It would be a scale of economic mobilization that Europe has not attempted since the ruins of year 1945. But here is the tragedy. In order to succeed, Europe would need to unify in a meaningful way. It would need to issue shared debt, simplify its complex bureaucracy, and stop behaving like 27 countries wearing a single coat. It would need to choose collective power instead of national pride. And at this moment, the political will for that level of unity does not exist. Germany does not want to pay for Italy's debts. France wants to protect its farmers. Eastern Europe does not fully trust Western Europe. Southern Europe does not fully trust Northern Europe. And Hungary continues to follow its own direction. This means Europe stands at a crossroads with two possible futures. The first future is a renaissance. In this future, Europe wakes up. It cuts away the bureaucratic vines that hold back its industries. It restarts nuclear energy. It supports families and rebuilds its demographic foundation. It welcomes innovation instead of regulating it to the point of suffocation. It builds a capital market capable of competing with Wall Street. It rebuilds its defense industry. It gives up short-term comfort in exchange for long-term strength. In this future, Europe becomes a creator again, not a relic. The second future is the museum. This is the path Europe is walking today. Slowly, calmly, and quietly. A beautiful retirement home for the wealthy. Tourists will continue to visit Paris, Rome, Barcelona, and Amsterdam. The food will remain superb. The architecture will continue to shine with centuries of history. But beneath the surface, the engines will slow down. Hospitals will become more crowded. Taxes will rise. Trains will run less often. The population that built Europe will shrink with each decade. The continent will become a mosaic of aging communities served by younger immigrants who try to keep the system functioning. It is not a violent collapse. It is a soft decline. It is a comfortable fading into irrelevance. There will be no riots, no dramatic fall, only quiet erosion. Some people will say that this is the natural cycle of civilizations, that no empire lasts forever. Rome fell, Byzantium fell, the Ottoman Empire faded. Perhaps this is Europe's turn. But the tragedy here is different. Europe did not fall because of invasion or disaster. It fell because of complacency. Prosperity made Europe slow, peace made Europe soft, regulation made Europe cautious, and demographics made Europe old. For 500 years, Europe explored oceans, reshaped continents, created modern economics, and built the most influential civilization on Earth. But in 30 years of hesitation, bureaucracy, and wishful thinking, it allowed its rivals to run ahead. And the lesson is not only about Europe. It is a warning for every country that believes success is permanent. Wealth is fragile. Power is temporary. Competitiveness must be rebuilt every decade. It cannot be inherited forever. If Europe can lose its edge, anyone can lose theirs. The world needs a strong Europe in economic, cultural, and strategic terms. Not because the past demands it, but because the future will be unstable without it. A balanced world is safer when power does not come from only America or only China. A world with 3 strong pillars is more stable and more innovative. But mathematics does not care about hope. Demographics do not respond to speeches. Energy shortages do not fix themselves. Bureaucracy does not simplify itself. Europe must choose. If you found this analysis bleak, that is a good sign. It means you understood the message. The decline of Europe is not guaranteed, but the decline is already accelerating. And if you want to understand why the United States surged ahead at the same moment Europe slowed down, you should watch the next chapter. It explains the economic advantage that allowed America to pull away while Europe drifted. The story of Europe's decline is not a prophecy carved in stone. It is a trajectory. It is a path. And a path can be changed if someone has the courage to step off it. But courage is rare in politics, especially on a continent where comfort has been the default for 3 generations. Comfort feels wonderful until you realize it has slowly eroded your strength. Europe today faces something deeper than an economic slump or a demographic slump. It faces a psychological crisis, a crisis of confidence. For centuries, Europeans believed, with good reason, that they were shaping the world. Today, many believe that the world is simply happening to them. They believe their best years are behind them. They believe the future belongs to Silicon Valley and to Shenzhen, not to Paris or Berlin. But history is full of civilizations that rediscovered their strength when the world least expected it. Japan rebuilt itself from ashes. South Korea rose from poverty and became one of the most innovative economies on Earth. China grew from isolation into global influence in less than 40 years. Decline is not destiny. Decline is a choice that is repeated over decades. Europe still contains the ingredients of strength. It has brilliant engineers. It has world-class universities. It has cultural influence. It has trillions of dollars in accumulated wealth. It has some of the most stable democracies on Earth. The question is whether Europe can rediscover its appetite for risk, whether it can rediscover its willingness to build, to experiment, to push forward, and to break the rules that no longer serve it. Because if Europe does not rebuild itself, others will shape the future in its place. The quiet signs are already visible. Many of the world's most ambitious entrepreneurs move to California. Many of the world's most ambitious manufacturers build in China. The fastest growing populations are in Africa and South Asia. Europe stands still while others accelerate. But this is not a eulogy, it is a warning. Warnings have the power to wake people up. Imagine, for a moment, that Europe chooses a renaissance instead of becoming a museum. Imagine it decides to build nuclear plants again, not 3 of them, but 50 of them. Imagine it creates a capital market strong enough to keep its own companies at home. Imagine it clears away its bureaucratic jungle and gives startups the freedom to scale the way American startups do. Imagine it shifts from regulating technology to inventing technology. Imagine it supports families in a way that makes raising children possible instead of making it feel like an economic penalty. Imagine it strengthens its military industry, not because it wants war, but because peace survives only when someone is strong enough to protect it. Imagine Europe choosing to become a superpower again, instead of becoming the world's most beautiful retirement home. The truth is simple. Europe does not need to become America. It does not need to become China. Europe only needs to become Europe again. The Europe that built cathedrals that reached toward the heavens. The Europe that sailed across oceans without maps. The Europe that invented engines, democracy, modern science, human rights, and the idea of individual freedom. Europe needs to remember who it was. Because when civilizations forget who they are, they fade. Not with chaos, not with noise. They fade with silence. And that silence is already spreading. If you look closely, you can see it. A restaurant in Rome that used to belong to the same family for 5 generations is now owned by a multinational company. A German factory that once buzzed with machinists now stands empty, its equipment shipped to Asia. A village school in France closes because there are not enough children to keep the doors open. Entire neighborhoods hold more wheelchairs than strollers. The signs are everywhere. But signs do not decide the ending. People do. Europe's story is not finished, but the next chapter will be determined by choices, not by nostalgia. It will depend on whether Europe chooses to clean the museum or reopen the workshop, whether it chooses comfort or courage, whether it chooses memory or ambition. And if you think this is only Europe's problem, think again. Every nation on Earth faces the same risk. Any country can grow complacent. Any society can forget the hunger that built its prosperity. Every generation is only one step away from believing that tomorrow will automatically look like yesterday. That is the final lesson of Europe's decline. Success is not guaranteed. It must be rebuilt. It must be earned again. It must be fought for again and again. If you have reached the end of this story, you already understand something most people overlook. Economies do not collapse from a single shock. They erode through slow decisions. Decisions that seem acceptable at the time but become catastrophic in hindsight. Europe did not fall off a cliff. Europe drifted until the horizon disappeared. Now the world waits to see whether Europe will drift further or turn back. If this story leaves you uneasy, that is a good sign. Uneasiness is the beginning of awareness. Awareness is the beginning of change. And if you want to understand why the United States surged ahead while Europe drifted, you should watch the next chapter. It explains the economic advantage that allowed America to accelerate while Europe slowed down. These stories are not separate. They are two halves of the same moment in history. Until then, stay aware. The world is shifting, and as Europe has just shown, even giants can sleepwalk into decline.